Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Ruben Kronig of Vineyard Time on Martha's Vineyard. And today I'd like to take some time to discuss the Roger Dubuis brand. Roger Dubuis watches are some of my favorite watches. And if you've been considering them in the vintage market and you've never held one, they're definitely worth taking a look at. What I would say is that understanding their history is the first step in understanding Roger Dubuis. Roger Dubuis was founded in 1995 by Carlos Diaz and Roger Dubuis. Roger Dubuis, the namesake of the brand, worked at both Longines and then at Patek Philippe. His time at Patek Philippe really inspired his direction and vision for the Roger Dubuis brand. Roger Dubuis watches were founded off the principle of producing mechanisms that had a quality level and finish level on par with Patek Philippe, but had a case design that was anything but classic. Their cases were avant-garde. Their cases were modern and unique, and they incorporated materials that weren't traditionally seen in classic watchmaking. Those elements of Roger Dubuis make them very special. So Roger Dubuis set out to create in-house movements, which they did very rapidly in their history. This is an important distinction between other watches of its day. Most watches in the 90s and into the early 2000s, Swiss watches like Breitling or Omega or Cartier, featured movements that were branded and had caliber numbers that made them appear to be in-house to the collector. However, those movements were predominantly made by ETA. Even when the manufacturer did modifications and simply bought a base movement, most of those modifications were on the surface. They added Geneva stripes, they added branding or engine turning, blued the screws, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's something lovely and it's a big piece of their history. Those brands were predominantly focusing on design and brand history and utilizing source movements. Roger Dubuis was not that. Roger Dubuis wanted to create an in-house watch, and they did. They made a watch that featured a whole variety of elements, from the case to the movement, that were finished at a level that was nearly unparalleled. Truly the only parallel that I personally can draw is Patek Philippe. The Roger Dubuis watches are finished at a very high grade. If you look at their cases and you look at the way that they polish and you look at the way that they brush their cases, those fine details are gorgeous. And there's very few watches that compare to them. Another important thing to keep in mind was their movements. They did a similar thing on their movements. Roger Dubuis worked very hard to create very high level finishes. They had the plates beveled and polished, they had the screws finished, and they worked very hard to ensure that their mechanisms were at a similar quality level of finish to a Patek Philippe. In order to make the world know that, and to showcase to the world that they had worked very hard to do so, they added the Geneva Seal. The Geneva Seal is an independent certification that allows a brand to showcase that their watches meet a specific set of criteria in finish, quality, aesthetic, and construction. And that was one of the things that made the Roger Dubuis watches interesting. Another thing that they did was they made their cases very distinctive. Those distinctive cases mean that when you're wearing a Roger Dubuis watch, you have a very unique looking watch on your wrist. They also made a whole variety of complications, whether that was a perpetual calendar, a retrograde perpetual calendar, or whether that was a simple three-handed movement. They were built to the top-end specifications. Roger Dubuis was purchased in the mid-2000s partially by Groupe Richemont and then later fully by Groupe Richemont. I personally have a little bit of a problem with how Groupe Richemont has handled Roger Dubuis. That said, let me step back and say that Groupe Richemont is one of my favorite watch conglomerates. They hold a lot of brands that I really like. That said, I feel as though they bought the Roger Dubuis name for their in-house movement making capability and haven't really focused on the brand as a brand. However, as a collector, that's not necessarily a bad thing for you. If you're looking at vintage watches, That has meant that there's been a glut of Roger Dubuis watches on the market that are very affordable compared to their original retail price and offer a lot of value. So let's look a little bit about collecting Roger Dubuis. If you're interested in a watch that is incredibly well made and you're interested in a watch that's unique to look at, Roger Dubuis is a watch that's worth looking at. When you hold it next to some of its competitors, you'll notice that that level of finish, the level of uniqueness and detail is far superior. They did a lot of unique things. Like if you look at the case on like the Easy Diver, there was inlaid carbon fiber. In the early 2000s, that was very unique. Even though we're seeing materials like that more and more today, in that time period, we didn't see it as much. That was distinctive. It's important to note that when you're looking at these watches, they were always a very high-end collectible and always a very high-end brand. I personally feel like their price was justified. There's a lot of brands that price their watches based on the market that they want to hit, more than actually what the cost of inputs are or what it takes to produce the watch. And while I'm not criticizing that, I will say that I feel Roger Dubuis actually offered a lot of value in their retail price categories. That said, at the current moment, you can purchase a vintage or used Roger Dubuis watch for a fraction of its original retail value. That makes it a super unique watch to look at. I would say that in the $5,000 to $10,000 range and in the $10,000 to $20,000 range, there are a lot of Roger Dubuis that are worth looking at. There's some of their watches that are going to be even more than that, although many are still greatly reduced from their retail, and that's because of the complication level. You're always going to pay more for a perpetual calendar than you are for a three-handed watch. That said, Roger Dubuis is a watch you should give some serious consideration to if you're looking for something that's both unique and super high quality. Thanks so much for tuning in. Please feel free to post any comments down below, and please hit the subscribe button. We should have new content for you weekly, and we appreciate your time. Thanks so much. Thanks for tuning in.